Welcome everyone to the Wednesday webinar. CUFI Campus is launching a series of discussions throughout the summer that will air every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. My name is Jessica Marzucco and I direct CUFI on campus. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Hannah Washington. I've known Hannah since she was a student and I was a field coordinator, and I had the privilege of working with her when she was doing incredible advocacy on her campus, from posters being defaced with anti-Semitic rhetoric to holding and hosting speakers such as Pastor Dumasani Washington and Kasim Hafiz. So Hannah is now a coordinator with CUFI on campus, and she also coordinates HBCU campuses. Today we're going to be talking about the amazing historical relationship between the Black community in the United States and the Jewish community in the US. It's so rich, and we wanted to bring this to you, our CUFI Campus network, to help just inspire you with the stories that I don't believe, and Hannah, you can speak more to this, I don't believe are really well known. There is so much to these incredible stories. Let's begin with you talking a little bit about the work you do coordinating HBCUs. For those who are watching and are not familiar with an HBCU, let's talk about how they began, maybe notable graduates, and some of the students we have on campus.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. So yeah, I coordinate the HBCUs on with CUFI on campus. And for those of you who aren't aware of the acronym, HBCU stands for Historically Black College and University. There are over 100 HBCUs in the United States, and basically what they are, these are higher learning institutions that were established during segregation. So, as we know, during segregation, education was also segregated, and so the Black community didn't have other opportunities for higher education. And so historically Black colleges and universities, they weren't historical at the time, they were new, but they were established to give the Black community the opportunity to pursue higher education, even though schools were segregated. So, and after schools were desegregated, the institutions were still kept alive, and many of them are still active today. These are really, really strong pillars in the Black community, these institutions. Some notable alumni who have graduated, in the past several generations are people like Samuel L. Jackson, the actor, or Oprah Winfrey, Spike Lee, Stacey Abrams, Jerry Rice, Chadwick Boseman, like lots of prominent actors, filmmakers, politicians, you name it, have gotten their success from historically Black colleges and universities. And so they're very important in terms of the quality of education and also the community building in the Black community in this country.
That's awesome. I remember we had the discussion a couple of weeks ago prepping for the virtual summit that CUFI held, and when you gave me the list of all of the influencers and the politicians and the artists that came from HBCUs, I was blown away. What an incredibly influential string of schools in this nation. And I know we have some fantastic students in the CUFI campus program who are HBCU students. And why don't you talk a little bit about some of our Bonhoeffer fellows and some of the activism that's being held?
Yeah, so we have several Bonhoeffer fellows at HBCUs. This past school year, they did a really great job with activism. A couple schools in particular where we had success. I have a Bonhoeffer fellow named Katura. She goes to Albany State University. She hosted an event with Irving Roth, the Holocaust survivor, back in January. And that event was really the largest event that I had in my region that school year up to that date. So she brought over 100 students and faculty to hear Irving Roth speak. She partnered with her NAACP chapter on campus, and also the student government. And yeah, got over 100 students and faculty to attend. We also have like a really strong chapter at St. Augustine's University. That's an HBCU in North Carolina. We have a chapter that's been growing very quickly. Bonhoeffer Fellow leading that chapter, Maria. And then our newest HBCU chapter was established last semester, in the fall semester, at Bethune-Cookman University. So I have a student named David. He's a Bonhoeffer Fellow. He worked really hard to get that chapter established, and I was up and running. Of course, we didn't get to do all the events that we planned because of COVID, but the chapter is growing. He has recruited pretty well so far. And yeah, these are a few examples of Bonhoeffer Fellows and some non-Bonhoeffer Fellows who have invested a lot into CUFI, and just the excellence that they bring to the program and the hard work that they put into it. It helps the program grow in general, but also, just shows, people who are watching how dedicated HBCU students can be to this cause.
So good. And I know our last Bonhoeffer trip to Israel this past summer, for those of you who are unfamiliar with what we're referencing, the Bonhoeffer Fellowship is a CUFI on campus initiative where we train students based on the character and activism of German pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who incidentally, when he studied in the US, he stood with the Black community in the United States against racism that he was experiencing. And we based this fellowship on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we take our students to Israel. And I remember we talked about David on the past trip. I remember he never met a stranger. He was friends with everyone, everywhere we went. So it was really fun. Let's talk a little bit about this rich history of the Black community and the Jewish community. So beautiful. Hannah is heading up the social media campaign that is appearing every Friday, and CUFI on campus is educating about this on social media. Let's talk a little bit about one of the first stories you shared, which had to do with Holocaust survivors and HBCUs.
Yeah, so this was like a really cool research project for me, just because I knew that there's always been a connection between the Black community and the Jewish community, especially during the civil rights era and a little bit before. But I didn't know how deep the relationship was. So I did some research, and I found lots of European Jewish professors, a lot of them from Germany, some from Poland, who escaped, Hitler's Nazi regime. A lot of them before the Holocaust was in full swing. So a lot of them got out, before the wars hit. But they came to the United States and really found like a second home amongst the Black community in the South and on the East Coast as well. There's really a lot of really beautiful stories. These professors who experienced discrimination firsthand because they were Jews in Nazi Germany and eventually Nazi controlled Poland, and they were able to escape, and they came to the United States, expecting this idea of complete freedom, and the United States is a free country, but we definitely had a lot of sins on our hands in terms of racism and the segregation that was going on in the South. And so these professors, they identified with the Black community because they knew exactly what it felt like to be on the other side of that. And so a lot of these professors, they dedicated their careers to teaching at Black colleges and universities, and not just teaching there, but working within the Black community, donating to local businesses, encouraging white citizens and Black citizens to commune, to come together. I remember one professor, Ernst Manasseh, he would host, Ernst Borinsky, he taught at Toulouse College. He would host parties and invite, his white friends and his Black friends, a lot of his Black students as well, and encourage commingling. And a lot of these Jewish professors, they put their lives at risk because there was such animosity when it came to, commingling between the two races. And so there's just something, kind of beautiful history that I was able to uncover, the sacrifice that they made, the social standing that they sacrificed. It was really, really interesting. And that relationship went on for many years after that. So this was happening around the 1930s. But, well into the 60s and 70s, the communities were still, strongly standing together. So it was just a really interesting project to head up.
Wow. Yeah, and all of this was happening in the 30s. These relationships were being built. Let's jump ahead about 30 years. Let's talk about the 1960s. I know when I was studying at Regent University, one of the books that I read in one of my theology classes was Prophets by Rabbi Abraham Heschel. And I fell in love with this man. I fell in love with his writings, so powerful. And I had always seen the picture of Dr. Martin Luther King marching alongside a rabbi in the social justice movement. And it was years later that I connected the dots and realized that this was Abraham Heschel. Let's talk for a minute about this relationship between him and Dr. King and some details about it that I think our viewers will find really interesting.
So yes, Rabbi Heschel he was a rabbi that felt a need, like a duty to get involved in the civil rights movement. Prior to it, he wasn't as involved. He was an activist, for other causes. And as an observant Jew, he really upheld, the ideals of justice and righteousness. And so he felt that even though he was a Jew, he had not very much connection with the Black community. He felt like he couldn't stand aside while the civil rights movement was going on and not help in some way. So he joined forces with Dr. King. The two of them, they marched together at several rallies. They spoke together side by side, and they had a friendship outside of their activism as well. They respected each other both as men of God, as preachers, and they had a great alliance in terms of activism as well.
Hmm. So with these relationships that began during the civil rights movement and after, Dr. King was assassinated, there were a group of people that were close to Dr. King who started an organization to support Israel. Let's talk a little bit about why it was established, what was the need, and who these individuals were.
Yeah, so shortly after Dr. King was assassinated, some of his colleagues, mainly Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, they were both civil rights activists with Dr. King, and they felt the need to establish what they called Black Americans to Support Israel Committee. It's called BASIC for short. They established it in 1975, and basically, before Dr. King was assassinated, he made it a point to really urge the Black community to continue to stand with the Jewish people, because at the time there was kind of a little bit of discord going on, is starting. There's one camp of the Black community that was loyal. They supported the Jewish people and Israel, and then there was another camp that was starting to embrace kind of the PLO version of justice, if you will. Yasser Arafat really infiltrated the Black community, a lot of the Black leaders, and found a way to kind of take the civil rights narrative and apply it to the extremism and terrorism that was happening in the Middle East. And so, unfortunately, a lot of young Black leaders specifically were starting to embrace this means of freedom fighting, the terrorism that was being labeled as freedom fighting, and starting to kind of look at as Israel and the Jewish people in a different way. So not so much Zionism. It was starting to become a kind of anti-Zionism, pro-Palestinian kind of. If you were really Black, you stood with the Palestinians. That was kind of the idea that was floating around. And Dr. King and some of his colleagues, they saw this, early on. They saw the idea changing. They saw a lot of young activists abandoning the Jewish people a little bit and kind of looking down on them a little bit. And so Dr. King, before he was assassinated, he made it a point to urge Black activists to continue to stand with Israel and the Jewish people. And then after he was assassinated, Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, they established BASIC to continue to bring together those who did support Israel and the Black community, and to encourage the next generation to continue to do so. It it went well for a while. They got, you know, a lot of support. Like if you Google basic, or if you it should be on Google, I think. They got over 200 signatures of, you know, prominent Black figures in the community at the time. Unfortunately, over time, the younger generation, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them still kind of fell into that, you know, Palestinian Authority deception, unfortunately. But the pro-Israel camp still existed, and it still exists today. And in a way, it's almost being revived a little bit, as we, you know, we can see with our growing number of HBCU students, and with other pro-Israel organizations as well. A lot of Black activists are recognizing, you know, kind of their roots, their heritage, and how Israel and the Jewish people tie into that. And so it's difficult because this narrative, this anti-Israel narrative, has kind of been in the community for a while now. That was back in the, you know, late 60s, early 70s. But because there had always been kind of a remnant in the Black community, the idea is kind of being slowly revived.
And of all the series and the stories we're sharing about this topic over the past several weeks on Facebook, which one has been the most inspiring or impactful that you've come across?
I have to say, a couple weeks ago, so we made a post, professor named Victor Lowenfeld, and he taught at an HBCU. I believe he was might have been Mississippi. I have to double check on that. But he taught at an HBCU. He was an art professor, and one of his students, today he's a more well-known Black artist named John Biggers. But when John Biggers was a student, he was a student of Victor's and Victor Lowenfeld, and he said, I found a quote I found a book that highlights a lot of these Jewish professors who taught at HBCUs, and in there, John Biggers was quoted as saying, he never saw anything quote unquote Black presented as beautiful or artistic until Victor Lowenfeld taught him. This Jewish professor introduced him to African art. So Victor had just a real affinity for African art. He just was drawn to it, and so he taught at a Black college, and so he brought this affinity with him. He, you know, figured it would fit great with these students, and he was surprised that a lot of the students, you know, there was a little bit of a disconnect between, you know, the African American students and actual African art from the continent of Africa. And so he saw this as an opportunity to help his students kind of understand a little bit more of their heritage, and, you know, to kind of evolve their own artistic style from their heritage. And so John Biggers, he said that Victor was the first person to show him some form of art that was Black, and also like just presented as beautiful, not presented as anything negative, you know, and which is understandable. Growing up in the segregated South, he was used to being, you know, second-class citizen, a lot of media kind of propaganda against the Black community. And so he was like, wow, these are African artists, and they're, you know, they're presenting Black as beautiful. And I just thought that was amazing that, you know, this young Black man found pride in himself and his people because this, you know, Jewish professor introduced him to this world of art that he had never seen before. I just thought that was amazing.
That is so cool. That's so cool. And if, you know, anyone's watching and has read that post, comment below, because Hannah puts these together. She works on these, she researches them, she puts them together. So shout out to Hannah for finding this, because these stories are not well known. I've never heard that story. And just looking at the correlation between the two communities, this professor came from a Europe that was incredibly anti-Semitic, and he was probably told that his community was lesser than and his art was lesser than. So the natural affinity here of two people groups coming together and awakening each other's realization of their beauty and their impact and their art and their stories. It's just beautiful. So I love this. I love this campaign. I love that we get to share these stories. I'm actually, would you mind kind of sharing how you feel that with your work with HBCUs and everything going on, where do you see the future of African American and the Jewish community relationship going forward?
So I think there's definitely hope for the future. I think if we can return to kind of the state of the relationship between the two communities that was, when Dr. King was alive and prior to that, I think it could do a lot of good for both communities. I think in the US, the Jewish community has done, an amazing job of uplifting the members of their community. A lot of my favorite filmmakers are Jewish, and I think that in terms of community building, pushing each other forward in terms of careers and education and everything, I think the Jewish community does a really good job of that. And I think that the idea of Jewish self-determination in community, I think that's something that the Black community could really benefit from if the two communities were to be as close as we once were. I think a lot of the success that the Jewish community has had after, eras and eras of persecution and being beat down, kind of being stomped on by history, they still have managed to rise. And I think that the Black community, because we have, such shared experiences of, discrimination and all those things, I think that we can learn from the Jewish community and how they were able to rise from that, from those crushing situations, yeah, definitely.
That's amazing. And I know such an important part of communities in this nation is sharing their stories. And I love that we can tap into these relatively unknown stories because we need to get to know one another and just the richness of who we are. I remember after last summit in DC, I went to the African American History Museum in DC, and was blown away. And there were sections with Abraham Heschel and Dr. Martin Luther King, and just the richness of these communities and the relationship. It was inspiring and beautiful. And I want to make sure we as an organization talk about this relationship more, because I don't see this coming up in conversations that are being had right now. And it's so inspiring. It's uplifting, and it's very encouraging. So Hannah, thank you so much for your work on this, and thank you for all the work you do with our incredible students all across your region. And hope to have you back on the Wednesday webinar. Maybe we can go more in depth with updates on these stories as this campaign continues on Fridays. So if you're watching, check out this series on Fridays. They will be in post form, and there's text, and there's just the backstory to this incredible relationship. So thank you again so much for watching. Thank you, Hannah, for doing our very first Wednesday webinar with CUFI on campus. So guys, we will see you again next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and go more in depth on topics that you want to know about. So thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.